and how it compares with retributive justice. And I involved a little bit in this work through my work at Community Advocates Public Policy Institute. That's where I work downtown. And I work mostly, I'm an economist, I work mostly on economic policy that has the goal of trying to lift people out of poverty. But there's this unhealthy nexus or intersection between people getting involved in the criminal justice system and people living in poverty. So I've come to understand and learn a bit about restorative justice. I'm not an expert. Actually, the older I get, the more I feel like I'm an amateur in all things in my life. But that's okay. And but I find it fascinating, and I am a little bit involved in some of the restorative justice efforts in the city. And I think that it's important. It plays an important aspect of how we as Christians are called to live out the kingdom of God or the beloved community. And there's some aspects of the current criminal justice system that I think are incompatible or inconsistent with the kingdom of God. And definition, we'll start off with a definition. Restorative justice is this idea that crime is a violation of people and relationships. It creates obligations to make things right. Justice involves the victim, the offender, and the community in search of solutions to promote repair, reconciliation, and reassurance. And that definition is by Dr. Howard Zehr from Eastern Mennonite University in Virginia. And it's interesting to me, in the field of restorative justice, there's a few communities of faith that are significant leaders in the field of restorative justice. The Mennonites are one, the Quakers are another, and then also interestingly, a number of places for leadership within restorative justice come from the Native American community, and this idea of circle and honoring the voice of each person. So I find that interesting that it's from some of these groups that are more on the margins of our wider culture, who are the ones who are leading us to a better place. Retributive justice. This is more of a characterization of the current criminal justice system that we have in the United States and here in Milwaukee. The crime is a violation of the state defined by law breaking and guilt. Justice determines blame and administers pain in a contest between the offender and the state directed by systematic rules. Again, that's a definition by Dr. Howard Zehr from the Mennonite University. The idea behind retributive justice is that if you have caused suffering, that it's a form of justice for suffering to be inflicted upon you. And it is a form of justice. It's a limited form of justice, and I don't think that it's one that's compatible with the teachings of Jesus. Different emphasis between retributive justice and just restorative justice. Retributive justice also has this idea of retribution or revenge. With restorative justice, or with the current criminal justice system, the questions that are asked: what law was broken, who broke it, how do we punish them? Restorative justice asks what harm was done and to whom, what needs have arisen based on that harm, and what obligation is there to meet those needs. So that gives you an idea of the underpinning of the difference between restorative justice and retributive justice. Now I'm going to play a short video from Santa Barbara in California that gives an idea for how restorative justice can work in practice. Bear with me.
Santa Barbara County is known as America's Riviera, that attracts people from all around the world. At the same time, we have real-world issues of crime, gangs, and juvenile delinquency. The restorative justice process brings juvenile offenders, their victims, and concerned community members together to repair the harm done by that offense.
Basically looking at how people were affected by this. Restorative justice allows victims, those who want to be a part of the process, and it can actually be a healing process for them. It also provides a mechanism and an opportunity for offenders to actually see firsthand the damage that's caused by the offenses that they commit.
Having that face-to-face conversation really seems to mean a lot to victims. And I think perpetrators, after they commit the crime, some perpetrators, those who would be appropriate to put in a restorative justice program, really also need to look into the eyes of the victim and understand the devastating effect they had on that victim's life. So I think both of them can come away from the situation better human beings as a result of having had that moment in conversation.
Restorative Justice Circle Conferencing, which is the model that we're using here in Santa Barbara County, is based on the notion that the consequence of harmful behavior is that relationships are damaged and people get disconnected. There's been recent research that emphasizes just how important connectedness to family and to the community is to young people.
Restorative justice has been successfully employed in many jurisdictions across the world. And here in Santa Barbara, we have embarked on a pilot project working with conflict solutions to use the technique to deal particularly with juvenile offenders. And we've seen a lot of success from this. We have seen, and I've heard very positive feedback from my staff members who are involved in getting a circle of people together that include the offender, that include the victim, that include law enforcement, the parents, and other people that are involved in the offender's life.
Conflict Solutions Center has stories about people whose lives have been changed as a result of this restorative justice process. I've heard from victims of these crimes talking about what an important process it was, and I also heard from perpetrators and family members of perpetrators saying if they had merely been incarcerated, they would never have learned. So if we're looking in our society to prevent crime and to reduce all the costs associated with the arrest and the prosecution of crimes, this is a terrific system.
We think the magic is the point of shift. When people come into the room for a conference, they don't know each other most of the time. And there's a kind of fear, what am I getting into? What am I doing here? And as they start to talk, they start to see each other as human beings. And the point at which you get a real shift where there is empathy, that you can feel all over the room, you can feel compassion for the pain someone's experienced. That's what we talk about as the magic. And when that happens, agreements are very, very easy to forge. The young man said, I did it. And I'm so sorry. And my grandmother taught me not to lie.
It's one of those wonderful moments that happens where you know that something wonderful happened that you precipitated by just having this conversation, which is essentially a small circle around the kitchen table.
I would just like to apologize to not only my parents, but the rest of the community, because I had no idea that my actions would affect so many other people.
He also was able to see the seriousness of what he could have caused.
It was astounding. The kid just broke down. I said, I'm so sorry. I had no idea how much this would affect everybody. And I'm really, really sorry. And let's see what we can do to make it better.
In this restorative justice circle, you're allowed to see not just a community, a big mass of people that you don't know. You're able to see faces and lives, and I think that really helps affect people towards remorse and realizing that they were wrong.
Part of the problem is compulsive behavior, that they don't think before they act. They're not recognizing that the choices that they're making are bad ones. They're not using good judgment, and hopefully the restorative justice process will allow them to understand the consequences of their negative actions, that they do have an impact in a negative sense on others, themselves, their community, the victims that they directly impacted, and their families. Everyone is impacted to a degree by the crimes that are committed.
De seguir adelante con esos planes hasta el final, hasta completarlo, a lo que tú te sometes a hacer ese plan.
And as important as restorative justice has always been, in my mind, it's even more important as an alternative now, because we have AB 109, which has been passed, which shifts the responsibility for incarcerating or coming up with an alternative to incarceration for a significant number of additional offenders who heretofore had been the responsibility of the state of California.
There isn't going to be room for them at the jail, so they're going to be on our streets. So they'll either be on our streets, involved in new crimes, leaving behind new victims, or they'll be on our streets in programs like this where suddenly the light is going on and they're going to learn that reoffending is just going to be a recidivist cycle that's going to land them back in prison.
So many children these days are growing up without sufficient opportunities to develop the vital human traits such as empathy, such as responsibility and accountability. Restorative justice interventions with youth provide an opportunity to experience responsibility, understanding the human consequences of their actions, with the byproduct being empathy.
We are encouraging accountability and taking responsibility for their actions. Those are characteristics of a healthy, productive, and contributing member of a community.
Over the last 2 years, our program implementation through the Conflict Solutions Center's Restorative Justice Partnership Initiative has made measurable results with only limited referrals. We are doing an excellent job taking care of the victim, the community, as well as repairing the harm done by the offender.
If we can reduce recidivism by turning attitudes around and by turning outlooks around, then I think that's a positive thing. And Conflict Solutions has really kind of led the way in this area for our county. And we're proud, and the DA's office and probation department and others are proud to partner with them in this effort.
We've had restorative justice programs for a while in our juvenile division in North County. We're trying to bring it down to South County, and it's critical that we fund this program so it can be brought down to South County. It will make a difference in crime, and it will make a difference in the lives of victims and perpetrators here in South County. So those funds are necessary in order for us to have that program here.
If we can prevent crimes from occurring in the future, then we do the greatest service to the community and the citizens that we serve. Much better than if we apprehend and punish through incarceration or other means someone who's already committed the crime. If we can take the reactive and also make it a means to become proactive as well, I think everybody wins in that situation.
Restorative justice will make a difference to victims, to perpetrators, and I believe to all of us countywide.
So that gives you an idea of what a restorative justice program looks like. Here in Milwaukee, we have through the district attorney's office, they do restorative justice programming that they call community conferencing in a number of the police stations around the city. Erin Catsby is the district attorney who is the facilitator. It's a structured process. She's a circle keeper. There are principles and guidelines. And in order for restorative justice to happen in a community conferencing setting here in Milwaukee, both the victim and the offender both have to agree to participate in that. And victims often talk about how the restorative justice circle is a healing experience for them. A lot of victims talk about how in the conventional criminal justice system, their voice is not heard. They don't have the opportunity to tell the offender the harm that has been done to them. Somebody who's been robbed at gunpoint, then having problems going out of their house because they're fearful. And the offenders, as strange as it sounds, they often are not aware of the damage that they do in the offense that they engage in. They just don't think about it. And not always, but sometimes what's happening with the offender is there's an African-American friend of mine, and his grandmother had a great phrase, hurt people hurt people. There are some people who grew up in very hostile environments, and they adopt a very hostile disposition to the wider world. What they've known is that they get hurt, and they become hard-hearted, and their way of dealing with the world in a retributive way is that they'll go out and hurt other people. There's a lady called Jojo Pa and Saloma, African-American lady who worked for many years down at the Alma Center in the city that does very good work with healing. It started to do its work with men who are convicted of domestic violence. And Jojo Pa and Saloma had this lovely phrase that pain that is not transformed is transferred. And part of our challenge in the inner city is this pain is ricocheting around the city. One person's pain leads to them inflicting pain upon others. And I honestly believe that the Lord shows us a way out of that. He shows us a way to transform that pain so that those who commit pain and suffering in the community can become in time wounded healers. And a wounded healer is a much more effective healer than somebody who wasn't previously wounded, because they're coming out of their own experience to bring healing to a place that in the past that they were causing pain. So what are some of the biblical guidelines for retributive justice versus restorative justice? And so on the tables here, I've got a few Bible verses, and somebody should have a small one and with number 1 there. If you'd read that would be great. Thanks, Andy.
But if a serious injury results, then you must require a life for a life, eye for eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and strike for strike. From Exodus chapter 21.
So in Exodus, we find a biblical basis for retributive justice. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You do me harm, then it's fair for the community to do harm to you. So that's interesting. Number 2, does somebody have the...
If anyone injures his neighbor, whatever he has done must be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he is injured the other person, the same must be inflicted on him. And that's from Leviticus.
So one thing that's becoming clear on this form of justice that we're encountering in the early books of the Bible is proportionality. So it's not an eye for a life or I suppose, a hand for a tooth. It's that there should be some degree of proportionality in the justice that is meted out on people. So that's important. Number 3. Thank you, Karen.
You must purge the evil from among you. Then the rest of the people will hear and be afraid, and they will never again do anything so evil among you. You must show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot. That's the 19th chapter of Deuteronomy.
So again, pretty harsh stuff. I've heard it said that one explanation for the harshness of these verses is this was the early stages of the creation of community, and out of great disorder, this brought some degree of order to things. But number 4.
You have heard it, that it was said, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. From Matthew 5.
So here we have the gospel and we have a shift. And the shift is going away from an eye to an eye, and it's talking about essentially loving our enemy. It's an important shift. So then there's this tension that we get from Scripture between retributive justice and a form of restorative justice. How do we make sense of it? Well, even if we go back to the early stages of Scripture, we've got the story of Cain and Abel. And God does not reward the killing of Abel by Cain with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. God spares Cain's life. Not only does he spare it, but Cain goes off into exile. And God protects Cain in exile and says that no harm should be done to Cain for what he did. So already we're starting to see in our understanding of God that he is not enforcing this very strict idea of retributive justice. Then number 5, should be on a table somewhere.
You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward do you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than the others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
So, as Lutherans, we come to see there's this tension between law and gospel. And the gospel is very clear in both number 5 and number 6 that we read there. Number 6, does somebody have a piece of paper with number 6? Yeah, could you read that? It's pretty long, so thank you.
I certainly recognize many early passages in the Bible that present God as punitive and retributive. But you must stay with the text and observe how we gradually let God grow up. God does not change, but our knowledge of God surely evolves. Mere divine retribution leads to an ego-satisfying and eventually unworkable image of God, which situates us inside of a very unsafe and dangerous universe. Both Jesus and Paul observed the human tendency toward retribution and spoke strongly about the limitations of the law. The biblical notion of justice, beginning in the Hebrew scriptures with the Jewish prophets, especially Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Hosea, is quite different. If we read carefully and honestly, we will see that God's justice is restorative. This term has only been around for about the last 25 years as human consciousness has evolved. In each case, after the prophet chastises the Israelites for their transgressions against Yahweh, I think, Yahweh, the prophet continues by saying, in effect, and here's what Yahweh will do for you. God will now love you more than ever. God will love you into wholeness. God will pour upon you a gratuitous and unbelievable, unaccountable, irrefutable love that you will finally be unable to resist.
Thank you. So it's interesting, the early parts of scripture that we're reading were quite strict in terms of retributive justice, but the truth is the Old Testament is full of stories of where people who sought God's mercy and sought to live consistent with the law of the Lord and the kingdom of God, God is always merciful to them. I think about David. David was essentially a murderer, and he certainly was a philanderer and a adulterer. And yet, through submitting to God and asking for God's forgiveness, God forgave him. I think that's fascinating because we don't think of David, when we think of David initially, we don't think of him as a murderer and adulterer. We think of him as faithful. I think the word David means beloved of God, or sure. Okay. So, and we think of him as this great, powerful king. So the gospel, the ministry of Jesus is centrally focused on repairing relationships, healing, restoring humankind to be in right relationship with God, forgiveness and mercy. And all of those are hallmarks of restorative justice practices as opposed to retributive justice practices. I'm going to play another short video with of a policeman and what his experience was with restorative justice.
I've been with the Longmont Police Department for almost 9 years. When I first heard about restorative justice, I was a little leery of the program. I was a new officer and just out of the academy, ready to hit the ground and go out and, protect people, arrest people, send them all to jail. That was my job. If you violate the law, you go to jail. The first time I did restorative justice, my eyes were kind of open to the process, and it really had an impact on me. It was several juveniles, about 6 to 8, that had broken into an old chemical factory here in Longmont. And as I was, working the night shift like all the new officers do, I came upon an open door and I saw bodies running from me. And they ran off into a field, and as a new officer, I chased, because that's what we do. And at the time I saw these boys in the field, they were hiding in the grass, tall grass, so I couldn't see these bodies. I just knew there were 6 to 8, to me, bad guys out in the field. And the dogs were coming. My gun was out, ready for someone to jump up and try and do something to me. So at that point, someone could have got severely injured, either by me with my gun, by any other use of force, or with the dog biting them. Eventually, I had them all stand up and give up, and I realized, oh my gosh, here I am, I'm out with these, 10 to 13-year-old boys. And I thought, but gosh, they've all committed felonies. They've all committed burglary from what they did inside the building. And I thought, oh my gosh, 10 to 13, I don't want to start these guys, with a felony criminal record. So I thought, or one of my restorative justice program. So I put them through the process, and that's what really, opened my eyes to what the program was like. And at that point, it was scheduled for what we called the circle process. At that point, I was like, a circle process. What exactly is that going to mean? Is that where we all get together in a circle and we hug each other? I'm not good with that. I'm a police officer. So we went to the circle process, and I was expecting pretty much that I would sit there and I would be the kind of the hardline cop and say, you boys are bad. You did a bad thing. I'm cutting you a break by sending you here to this, circle process and saving you. But it didn't turn out to be that way at all. It was completely different from what I expected. When it was over with, or actually during the circle, when I had my time to speak, I kind of surprised myself because I wasn't in that authoritative role. It was more of educating the kids, and to a great degree their parents, because their parents were there also. These boys could have gotten severely injured inside the building because it was a chemical factory. They actually made gold-plated components for the aerospace industry. So in doing that, they had large vats of hydrochloric acid inside. So the building was basically a biohazard building. But once I explained the bad things that could have happened, the parents were in tears and actually thanking us for it turning out the way it did and not the terrible way it could have. So it made a major impact on everybody. Yeah, I came to see the restorative justice process as a very positive thing, something that I could use, especially as I got on more and more in my career. I would start to see people who would violate the law, criminals, people I would arrest, and I would see the same people over and over again, to the point where you start to know their names. And the kids and the people that I dealt with in the restorative justice, I wouldn't see them again. Or if I did, it was more of a drive-by and a wave. But I started to see it more as a tool to help the people that needed help, because they essentially just needed an education. They needed to see how what they did affected more than I broke the law, I got probation. They go into the court system, they either have a plea deal or they go through a trial, and if they're found guilty or they plead guilty to the charge, then a lot of times they'll go into probation, and they'll go through the probation process and have community service. And once they satisfy that and satisfy the terms of their probation, they'll be done. With restorative justice, they still have a process they have to go through, and it's a process that can take, several months. After the circle, we determined, okay, what's going to make this right? Everybody in the circle, everybody that was affected by it says, how are we going to make this right? And we come to an agreement with the subjects that are in there that are part of that circle that, okay, this is what you have to do. So they do have a process, but they're not going into the process of, say, that same kid who did the graffiti may go out and help clean up a park, take an active role, and actually, instead of destroying his community, he realizes, I can help make my community better. But because he's going into that, where he may have a few hours he has to spend at the park, not as this is my punishment, it's more of, okay, I did something wrong, I now understand that it's not just a wall, but it was the community I affected, and there were people involved. I'm gonna give back, I'm gonna make it better. In the restorative justice process, people have to take responsibility for what they did. To even be considered for the process, they have to admit and take responsibility for, yeah, that was me who did that. And then the officer can determine, okay, they're taking ownership of what they did immediately, So now we can take them to the next step and put them into the process. So in a normal situation of law enforcement where someone did something and I'm going to charge them, oftentimes they won't take any sort of ownership for it because what are they doing? They're admitting that they did something wrong and they know they're going to be put into a court process. The Restorative Justice program impacts the victims in a much better way than the court system often does. A court system can order someone to pay somebody back for damage they may have caused to their house or their property, and those people will get that back. But there's no healing, there's no closure between the victim and the person that did the crime. I believe restorative justice fits for any sort of crime. I've sent anywhere from petty offenses up to recently a 7 or 8 count felony adult crime. This year I had a crime where someone committed several counts of felony prescription fraud. And I was hard on the case to find that person, locate them, identify them, arrest them on felonies, and send them to jail for what they'd done. After working my case and finding my suspect and meeting with my suspect, I realized this isn't that hardcore drug-addicted person who needs to go to jail. It was a mother who was a choir instructor full-time, who had children, who had a very supportive family around her, from her husband to her in-laws. And I realized, oh my gosh, I don't want to assist this person in destroying their own life with a felony, several felonies. Knowing that there's restorative justice available to you, it gives you more options. It helps you to look at people and say, okay, this is a serious crime. Are you a serious criminal? Well, maybe it might not work for you. Or is this a serious crime, but I don't think you're a serious criminal? Then it's definitely a good program to send the people through. The criminal justice system is needed. It does work. But in order to reduce crime overall, I believe statewide, we need to increase our use of restorative justice because of the impacts that it makes, what I believe the future criminals it takes out of the system.
So that's from Colorado. The other one was from Santa Barbara. So a few years ago, we had Janine Jeske from Marquette University Law School here. She spoke on restorative justice. And at the Law School of Marquette University, they've got a particular emphasis on restorative justice. She's also a Supreme Court justice here in Wisconsin for a number of years. And I think it's interesting. Part of our justice system here is characterized with an adversarial disposition. There's right and wrong, there's winners and losers. And they go all out in order to, for one side to prevail at the expense of the other. But in truth, that binary idea of 1 and 0 doesn't serve us well. It doesn't serve us well as Christians either. And there's a lovely phrase, Lutheran phrase, that we're all saints and sinners. You know, life is messier than, and the people who are most judgmental are often people who are pushing for 1 and 0 solutions to things. These people are all bad and we're all good, and that doesn't serve us well. So I worked on policy, and in 1972, the state of Minnesota passed the Community Corrections Act. And what that act did was it made state funds available to local communities to fund things like restorative justice practices and alternatives to sending people to jail and prison. And Wisconsin did not. We followed up in the late 1990s with something called Truth in Sentencing, which significantly increased the term of confinement for people overnight here in Wisconsin. So we have slightly more people in the state of Wisconsin than they do next door in the state of Minnesota, but we have more than 22,000 people in state prison, and they have somewhere about between 9,000 and 10,000 people in state prison up in Minnesota. They spend $450 million a year on their Department of Corrections. We spend $1.3 billion a year on our Department of Corrections. That's $800 million that we don't have for the University of Wisconsin system, that we don't have to fix our roads. And I think about sinfulness. Sinfulness is where something is portrayed, and there's an essential deception in sinfulness. where something is portrayed as being, if we follow this path, we'll find something that's good. And sinfulness in our own life is often around temptation. We're tempted to take more of something that is truly good, but we elevate it to it being a false god. For instance, money. Money is a good thing. It helps us to function in society. But if we seek just more and more money and we want the power from it, it becomes a false idol. And the thing about false gods is they're never satisfied. The real God is satisfied. As we're in relationship with the real God, we find the things that come, the fruits of the Spirit. We find peace, joy, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. When we're dancing with false gods, we get none of those things. False gods have appetites that are never satisfied. But we get in this pattern where we think, if I can just feed that false god a little bit more, it'll give me the things that I'm looking for. But it never will. And one false god that we've danced with in Wisconsin for the past 20 years is this idea, if we just build more prisons and lock up more people, we'll make our community safer. And that's not true. Many people who commit crimes are people who are damaged. And by sending them in large numbers to jail and prison, we just damage them more. And most people who are in prison, most people in jail, all people in jail and most people in prisons will come back to the community. And unless and until we create a way to restore them, for a path for them to follow to be in good standing in the community, they will just continue to hurt the community and hurt themselves. So I want to play a short video now from Marquette University. I played that one already. Well, here, I'm going to give you a few examples of the adoption of restorative justice practices in schools. So this here is up in Barron County in northwestern Wisconsin. There was a judge, Judge Brunner from Barron County, who was one of the early leaders within the criminal justice system for restorative justice practices. And he started using it in the juvenile courts. And over a 10-year period, they reduced the number of young people being incarcerated up in Barron County by 2/3. They reduced it by 66%. And the folks in the community saw how good that was, and they started to adopt some of those practices then into the school disciplinary structure. And this is a few years old now, but from Riverview Middle School in Barron County, they adopted restorative justice practices. And I just want to go through a few slides here and show you some of the benefits that derived from that. Well, here's an example. 3 7th grade boys cornered a 6th grade boy in the restroom during school dance. And one of the 7th graders gives the 6th graders a swirly. That's where he sticks his head in the toilet and then flushes the toilet. How would the school handle this issue? How would you handle this situation? And this is the contrast between handling it retributively versus restoratively. That the misbehavior is defined as an act against authority, that accountability is equated to suffering or consequences, focuses on what rule was broken, low support and traditional consequences. Restorative practices, misbehavior is defined as an act against a victim who was hurt. Accountability is equated with taking responsibility and repairing the harm. There has to be an admission by the causer of the hurt and the harm that I'm responsible for that, and that I will be a participant in trying to repair that harm. High support and creative solutions. I think the creative solutions is interesting. We first encounter God in Genesis as the creator, as this great creator of unimaginable imagination, that he calls order to the cosmos. And that imagination is something that we also have, being created in the image of God. And we're bound by our thinking. We're largely bound by our thinking when it comes to retributive justice and how we deal with the criminal justice system here in our current day and age, and it squeezes out imagination and creativity. This is interesting. This is an interesting graph here. You've got control on the y-axis and support on the x-axis, and with a punitive justice system, you've got a lot of control but not a lot of support. The community is not very involved, including the victim not very involved. You don't want this one either. You don't want to just neglect the harm that's been done, that somebody's been hurt. So this is just being irresponsible. Permissive is where you see there's harm, but you take no action to repair that harm. That also is not consistent with the kingdom of God. But restorative is where you acknowledge the harm that's been done, and that together with the victim and the offender and the community, you define a path for how that harm can be repaired. New guidelines: do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Accept responsibility for your actions, fix the problems. I just want to get to the numbers here. So in that high school, I'm not sure it was a high school, in that school in Barron County, over time they got to eliminate noon detentions. They reduced suspensions by 80%. There was a decrease in the number of police referrals by approximately 90%. So I'm from Ireland originally. I went to school in Ireland, elementary school, and in Ireland it's just 2 schools. The first 6 years is called junior school, and the second year is senior school. There was never a policeman in Irish schools when I was a kid. And the idea that there's a policeman in all of our high schools and middle schools here is not how it used to be, and it's not how it has to be. And one of the things that we've lost is we've lost our way. And we've lost our way in relationship. And that way that we've lost is there's a fraying of the social cohesion for healthy relationships, how we are with each other. And a year or 2 ago, Sharon Lerman and Heather Sattler from Alliance High School came here to talk, which is an NPS school, and they do restorative practices with the kids. And Alliance High School sent their public resource officer, their policeman or policewoman away because they no longer needed them. So all these are signs of healthy community. So that's one example here in Wisconsin of where restorative practices got adopted. And I'll just very briefly do this next one here. The Los Angeles School District, Unified School District, has also done work with restorative practices in a number of pilot schools. And this is a PowerPoint from 2016, just a few years ago. I'll just scroll down to, they had a number of pilot schools who adopted restorative practices and had trained circle keepers. And this was the instructional days lost to suspension, their decline. In 2007, 2008, 74,000 instructional days were lost to suspension. It's a huge school district. And by 2014, 2015, 6,221. That's a sign of a community that's getting healthier. And at the heart of that was adopting restorative justice practices as a means to deal with discipline problems. So just a few more slides. There's a short video from Marquette University. Before I show the video from Marquette University, I'm interested in us talking a little bit more about restorative justice practices and what your thoughts are and how it fits in with your understanding of God and the kingdom of God, or where the tensions are. Anybody have any experience of restorative justice practices? Maybe you could share a little bit with us.
I've been to the Green Bay Correctional Institute with Professor Geske, because this was the restorative justice class at Marquette Law School was one of the best classes I took during my law degree. And we'd sit in a room with felons of all sorts that were on their way to being released. So this was a required part of their pre-release curriculum, as it were. And we had to go through 5 big iron gates, and you couldn't move, into the next one until the last one closed. It was just, very impactful from that standpoint. And then you sat for 3 days with a group of felons that have been, some of them spending 40 years in that spot, and talked about essentially the harm that they've created not only to their victim but to everybody else in the community, the victim's parents, their parents. If it was a robbery, anybody else that might have seen it, we had that type of hurt and just kind of named those and increased the awareness for these people as to what they did. And it was just amazing. The fear the first time, going up to, one of the hardest high security prisons in the state of Wisconsin. But the experience afterwards was transformative for all of us that participated. There were probably 30 of us community members that sat within the circle and just listened and participated and talked about some of the hurt and harm in our lives also. And it just kind of made us a little more equal. And I think it really was impactful among all of the participants in the room to help prepare them and gain empathy. I think that was the biggest thing that came out of it was they really didn't empathize with what harm they'd caused, but they really had a better sense of it when it was all done. And it was an amazing program.
That's a wonderful program, and a magnificent way to prepare those men for coming back to the community and helping them to heal from the trauma or the hurt that fueled their initial crime. So there's a short video here which I'll play. It's there's parts of this that are I invited my daughter Alina here, but parts of this video are really tough. So this is Janine Geske at Marquette Law School. This was a conference they had earlier this year.
As I described for you, the purpose of the circle is for us to sit here each as part of the human family and to share experiences that may have impacted you. And we're looking specifically at the issue of violence and trauma occurring in Milwaukee.
In August 2009, I lost my dad to a violent crime. He was a homicide victim in the rear of his home after parking his truck. They suspected it was an armed robbery where he was robbed and it went bad. He was shot and he passed right there at the back of his house in the alleyway. I was getting lost, just death itself was sinking in on me.
I never really told this story completely in detail, not even to my mom. Summer that I turned 13 years old, I played with a girl. She was a year older than I was. We played all summer long. We were both products of broken homes, single moms. Both had stepfathers that we really didn't care much for. She had got home from school, and I had gotten home later. And come over. So I go over there, and her parents were fighting, but it was pretty much the norm. Didn't think anything of it. I got downstairs, started to walk across the street. She comes running outside. Billy, please come back, please come back, please come back. They're fighting again. So I turn back around, go up the stairs, and her mom has the butcher knife, and she goes up and stabs it. Right dead center, his chest. And I remember seeing him fall. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I looked at her mom, and I just ran. Ran across the street, I just left. Ran in the house, ran in my room, shut the door, didn't say anything to my mom, and remember just staring outside the window.
When I was 2, my father killed a woman in the South. Maybe 5 years ago, I remember people saying, oh, he's gonna be gay, he's gonna be this, he's gonna be that. And I would hear a lot, he's just like his father, he looks like his father, so on and so forth. To me, I'm thinking they saying, I am my father. So to me, who is my father? So then I find out he was this extremely violent individual. He was a robber and so on and so forth. So I thought that's how I would be. I was very violent when I was controlling because inside I knew a lot of things I did was wrong,
But but the outside, the world I lived in, the way I was believing was wrong. That's not the way where I lived that was. So I didn't fit in, and so it could cause me more and more confusion. So when I started going to jail, catching these different cases, like again, extremely violent, when I would spend most of my time in the hole, and I was always comfortable, isolated, because I could take off those masks, I could be myself.
My husband and I have 3 children who are all grown, Jay, Linda, and Dan. 2004 was a year of highs and very low lows for our whole family. Jay, who was 34, got engaged to his soulmate, the love of his life. He had done his day shift and had volunteered to take a colleague's night shift from midnight to 7, 8 in the morning. And on the way to where they were going to do surveillance, he stopped at a gas station because he was very tired and went in, got his coffee, came out, and as he walked back to his car, he was confronted by 2 young men. One had a gun pointed at him, and the other walked past him and then turned and felt for Jay's wallet. When he felt for his wallet, he felt his gun and said to his partner with the gun, "Dude has a gun." And Jay said, "I'm police, don't." And he was shot. We were called at 1:20 in the morning. I will never forget that phone call. He really fought to stay with us. But on November 5th at 10:50 in the morning, he was declared brain dead.
So, I guess there's there's a lot of suffering in the world. And as Christians, we're called to go to that suffering and to be agents of healing. That looks different for each of us. But our wider culture is desperate for the healing touch of the Lord. And the voices that prevail, too many voices that prevail currently, are not consistent with the will of God. And I guess we as Christians have to find our voice, because the world will go to hell in a handbasket. I appreciate people of St. Matthew's and how we work together to try to live faithfully. And I'd encourage us from like what you're talking about, Pam, that there's courage required to go into the places of heart and world. Because this is unknown, we don't know what's going to happen. But yeah, be encouraged that the Lord is always with us. And little David going out against Goliath, that's all he had was the Lord going with him. And the Lord greatly rewards when we take a risk for him. And the world needs us to take a risk for him. The people who push guns, we just need more and more guns, are irresponsible. The people who, there's many voices that are encouraging us to go in directions that are not consistent with the will of God. And there are too few voices that are encouraging us to go in the direction that is consistent with the will of God. We have to find our courage to be faithful to God. So that's why I love restorative justice. I think it's just a wonderful thing. And at its best, at its simplest, it's just being in a circle, observing certain ground rules about how we talk and listen to each other, so we get ourselves out of some difficulties that we're in. So, questions or observations or discussion? It's like 9:45 now, or 10:45.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Connor, I'll share something.
Sure.
So when I was 19, I was arrested for a minor drug offense, so marijuana possession. This was in Madison in the late 90s. And I was offered the opportunity to participate in Dane County's drug court program. So it was about a year of counseling, treatment, bi-weekly appearances in front of a judge. And it completely changed my life. I mean, I got off drugs, I went back to school, and again, this was a misdemeanor offense. I wasn't going to go to jail, but it was very much a turning point in my life. And so instead of going through the rest of my life with this on my record, it was stricken from my record, and it was a complete turnaround for me. So
thanks be to God.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. Yes,
I was just wondering how difficult is it to get a program like that in the high school, like in the Milwaukee High School, where it's probably very needed with all the problems they have there?
Yeah, so at Alliance High School they do it, Heather Sattler and Sharon Merman, and then for the district attorney's office it's available in a number of MPS high schools. But my understanding is the bureaucracy of MPS makes it difficult for it to get more widely accepted. One of the beauties of the Restorative Justice program at Alliance High School is the circle keepers are students themselves. They're young people, and they're young people who come from neighborhoods and parts of the city that are under a lot of stress. And they themselves see blessed are the peacemakers. The circle keepers are peacemakers. They see the merits of that, and there's actually an effort at the moment to try to extend those trust circles or those peace-building circles into Milwaukee Public Library system, so that on a monthly basis in the public library that people could gather together for circle. They held one down at Center Street Library a number of months ago, and it was just not long after a young child had been killed in that neighborhood, and that became the subject for the discussion. But I guess strength is perseverance, and what's required is for us to persevere more, particularly with MPS, so that restorative practices would be as widely adopted as it is in Los Angeles schools. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Have you seen any restorative circles with bullying?
Yes, they can be used for bullying, and they're productive and fruitful. sometimes I remember a restorative justice circle keeper shared with us that this was down at an MPS school. There was one girl who was really very unkind to her other classmates and would bully them. And they convened a circle to discuss that. And that young girl, when she would go home, she would be terribly belittled and bullied by her father. And not until that came out did the group of students in that class come to understand what was happening in that girl's life. And it became a point of reconciliation and support between them, but it can be effectively used for bullying purposes, yes. Mm-hmm. And I think bullying is an example of where a community is in an unhealthy state, where some members of the community are oppressing other members of the community. And that's a wake-up call. What is it about how we constitute this particular form of community that people are being hurt? And restorative practices. So then in some elementary schools, there's these lovely stories about the teacher sitting down with the very young children, 6 and 7 years old, and having a talking piece. And there's a nice, wonderful little book called Retributive Circle Process, I think it's called. And it speaks in there about how the kids are then out in the playground, the little kids, and 2 little girls come running up to the teacher and say, teacher, we need the talking piece, we need the talking piece. And they got the talking piece and they went back to where the transgression happened in the playground, and the kids themselves created their own circle to repair the harm because they saw one kid bullying another kid. So we teach our kids the techniques for how to live in the beloved community or the kingdom of God. And those are practical ways that they learn that. Mm-hmm. So,
if we believe in the restorative justice system, outside of educating ourselves and sharing, how beneficial it would be to implement in systems or sharing the news with friends and family, give you recommendations on how we could help be an impact for change in the system.
Yeah, so one of the things that the Wauwatosa School District is considering at the moment is how to deal with discipline issues and also how to deal with fault lines across issues of race. And I know Nick Hughes has had a number of listening sessions, and then up in Montello Middle School also. I think if you added your voice to having restorative practice circles as being a method for helping to build healthy community in our schools, I think it would be beneficial for our schools. Then the DA's office runs something called community conferencing, and they're always, not always, but I believe that they're looking for community volunteers to be part of that. There's 3 parts to a circle. There's the victim, there's the offender, and there's the community. And I've known people over the years who are community volunteers for that community conferencing. And if that's something, there's a woman called Erin Catsby who runs those circles, and I could speak to Sue about having her come and give an adult education about how that works, and if people would be willing to contribute some time to that, it would be a way of helping to build a healthier community. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I was going to say, as far as the Wauwatosa schools, it ebbs and flows. I have 2 daughters who now are in their 40s. We're both part of these circle groups going through high school, dealing with race. It kind of comes and goes, and I think a lot of it depends on what's welled up by parents instead of, being supportive to get that going. And it had a phenomenal impact on both of my daughters.
And I think in our because we're a high-performing school district, we sometimes overlook some of the challenges that exist within our schools. I think particularly for students of color, that we assume that because our kids go to school with children of color, that we're going to end up with integration, and that's not necessarily the case. I know some of the African American kids who come to school in Milwaukee, who live in Milwaukee and come to school in Wauwatosa, they've learned how to code shift. They've learned how to exist in this overwhelmingly white middle class world that our kids have been raised in. And they put on masks. And that's not true integration. We're not truly in community there. It's a form of pseudo-community as opposed to authentic community. And Wauwatosa Church is pseudo-community, where we all go around and just put on masks and pretend not to have challenges. And I think that's one of the reasons Stephen Ministry is good for us, among others. And Wauwatosa School is the same thing. And I think the thing that was brought up there about bullying and forms of abuse and oppression, those are signs of unhealthy community. And if they are prevalent in the community, then you've got some form of pseudo-community as opposed to authentic community, and something needs to be done. So, well, I appreciate your time and interest and your support, and I'll invite Erin Kathy, and maybe you can have her come here. Thank you very much.
Did you guys talk to Petey or what was the